Today's lesson is on the battles of World War II, and our essential question is, what strategies did the U.S. use and what new technologies were introduced? So in World War II, the United States was fighting in two theaters of war. The Pacific Theater was our fight against Japan, and then the European theater is where we fought Germany and Italy. The European theater also includes Northern Africa and the Mediterranean Ocean. It's not an ocean, it's a sea. Some notable names from the Pacific Theater include the commander of the Navy, Admiral Chester Nimitz, seen here, and commander of the Army, General Douglas MacArthur. These were two of the men calling the shots and creating our battle strategy within the Pacific. So we're going to start our discussion with the Pacific Theater today. Island hopping was the United States' plan or strategy to fight the Japanese. So island hopping included capturing Pacific islands one by one, liberating them from Japanese control on our way to mainland Japan. At the beginning of the war, we were not sure whether we would have to launch a mainland invasion of Japan, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to be within range if that became a tactical necessity. So the Philippines were one of the United States holdings in the Pacific, and the Philippine Islands were invaded by Japan in 1942. Douglas MacArthur, that we just talked about, led the American troops in the Philippines. The Philippines did not go well. Japan ended up winning the Philippines. MacArthur was forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and was able to hold off attacks from the Japanese for several months. His men were forced to survive off of eating mules and monkeys, but unfortunately MacArthur and his men had to surrender. MacArthur was ordered to go to Australia. We see here's the Philippines, Australia down here, in order to avoid capture, and he had to leave behind majority of his men. So Japan won. The United States is forced to surrender in the Philippines. And those American soldiers that were captured were led on what was called the Bataan Death March. Over 75,000 U.S. soldiers marched over 60 miles away to a prisoner of war camp. We can see here the Bataan Peninsula, the Death March, some of the men that were in that march. Many men died on the way. Around 7,500 men perished on this death march. And after it was completed, Japan officially had control of the Philippines. MacArthur promised, "I shall return to the Philippines." Some of those who were witness to the Bataan Death March shared their thoughts. If people would fall down and couldn't go any further, the Japanese would either bayonet or shoot them. They would also bayonet prisoners who couldn't keep up. Those who stepped out of line or had fallen out of ranks were beaten with clubs and or rifle butts. Some American prisoners who couldn't keep up were run over by Japanese vehicles. I saw the remains of an American soldier who had been run over by a tank. I didn't see the actual event, but the Japanese just left his remains in the middle of the road. We could see them as we walked by. So early in the war, Japan had dominated the Pacific Theater. The United States was not doing well that first few months of the war. They had to regroup. The Battle of Midway, which happened in June of 1942, was a turning point for the United States. The commander at Midway was Chester Nimitz. And what happened to set up this battle was that the United States intercepted a Japanese message and found hints of movement towards the island of Midway. We were not sure this was a possibility. We could have gotten our intel wrong, but we took a big chance on launching a surprise attack at Midway. And we sent the bulk of our Navy for a sneak attack. We turned out to be right. This big chance paid off because the Battle of Midway, the United States inflicted the worst defeat for Japan of the war. At the Battle of Midway, they lost 4 aircraft carriers, 250 planes, and for the United States, our losses included just 1 carrier. That is why the Battle of Midway is the turning point of the Pacific Theater. Japan was now on the defensive, and the United States had the upper hand. So as the tide begins to turn in favor of the Americans in the Pacific, we shift our focus towards Europe. So, the European theater. The plan in Europe was to defeat Germany first and then go back to worrying about Japan. We needed to keep Hitler from controlling all of Europe. So, the soldiers in the Pacific, though they are fighting throughout the course of the war, did not get as much aid and supplies as those in Europe at first. The Allied strategy in Europe involved lots and lots of bombing, but there were 2 specific types of bombing, and a mixture of these 2 was our strategy. First of all, saturation bombing, which was intended to inflict maximum damage to Axis lands and holdings, and also strategic bombing, which focused specifically on Germany's capacity to make war, such as bombing their factories and industrial centers. Between January of 1943 and May of 1945, a little over 2 years, the Allies dropped approximately 53,000 tons of explosives on Germany every month. 53,000 tons a month. The Tuskegee Airmen were critical to this strategy that involved saturation and strategic bombing. The Tuskegee Airmen were an African-American fighter squadron, so their job was to escort the bomber planes and protect them from enemy fire. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African-American military aviators, and they were extremely successful during World War II. In more than 1,500 missions that they flew, they never lost a single bomber. They protected their bomber on every mission. The reason why the Tuskegee Airmen are called that is because they were trained at Tuskegee in Alabama. You'll remember we talked about the founding of Tuskegee by Booker T. Washington. So the turning point in the European theater was the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is in the Soviet Union. So the Battle of Stalingrad took place between Germany and the Soviet Union. So at this point, Germany has turned on the Soviet Union. They are attempting to invade the Soviet Union as part of Hitler's conquest to control all of Europe. So the German objective at Stalingrad was to take over the oil fields in Stalingrad. This would shut down the Russian military and economy and allow Hitler to gain control of the Soviet Union. However, you'll see that the dates of the Battle of Stalingrad run from August until February. Hitler made the crucial mistake of attempting to invade the Soviet Union during the winter. The outcome of Stalingrad was that Germany was forced to surrender January 31st, 1943, and forced to retreat. So the importance of Stalingrad is that it's the turning point in Europe because the Soviets are now on the offense. This also ends Hitler's hope of dominating Europe. Even though at the end of Stalingrad, Hitler still has plenty of control over Western Europe, now the Allies have the upper hand. So the Casablanca Conference was a meeting between FDR and Churchill, the President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And at Casablanca, they make two decisions. First of all, they're going to increase the bombing of Germany and also to invade Italy. They also agreed that they would only accept an unconditional surrender from Germany and Italy. An unconditional surrender means giving up completely without any concessions. All right, that they would just be completely and utterly defeated, and there would not be any negotiations. Italy was the soft underbelly of Europe, the weakest place to attack. So they began devising a strategy to invade Europe through Italy. So this is where North Africa comes into play. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was in charge of the Allied forces in North Africa. The goal there for the Allies was to force Germany out of that territory so they could have a hold on it to use to invade Italy. The Allied forces do win in North Africa, which sets us up for the fall of Italy. So the Allies invade Italy, attacking the island of Sicily first and then moving into mainland Italy. At this point, Italians are tired of war. They surrender to the Allies September 3rd, 1943, without very much of a fight. The importance of the fall of Italy is that Mussolini is removed from power. He's not quite ready to give up yet. He flees to northern Italy and sets up a puppet government there. But, well, I was going to say unfortunately, but not quite. Mussolini was eventually killed by his own people. The fall of Italy is also important because Italy surrenders. So now Germany is left pretty much on their own in Europe. Here is a picture of Mussolini and his mistress after being shot. Their bodies were hung up on display. The Tehran Conference in November of 1943 was a meeting, one of the first meetings of the Big Three. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. All right, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was one of many meetings between these three leaders of the Allied nations. So the decision made at Tehran was to invade France across the English Channel. Why do we need France? To be able to invade Germany from the west. All right, the ultimate goal of the Allies is for the Soviet Union and to invade from the east. Great Britain and the United States invade from the west and force Germany to surrender. So this sets up D-Day. D-Day was part of Operation Overlord, which was the plan for the Allies to invade and take back Western Europe from Hitler's control. D-Day's technical code name was Operation Neptune. That referred to just the specific D-Day landings. Another thing about D-Day, the term D-Day is used for any beginning date of um, a military plan. I'm very good at words today. Um, the reason why that we associate D-Day with June 6, 1944 is because it is the most famous D-Day in all of history. But that's a term that is a general term, not just specific to the invasion at Normandy. So, D-Day took place at Normandy, France. This is the coast of France, right across the English Channel from Great Britain. D-Day was the largest amphibious invasion in all of history. And by amphibious invasion, I mean that we used naval ships to launch both ground and air attacks for this invasion. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, led the Allies at D-Day. He was the supreme commander over D-Day, and he was the mastermind behind Operation Overlord and Operation Neptune. D-Day is nicknamed the longest day, also the name of a movie about D-Day. And the purpose was to gain a foothold in France to be able to move troops and supplies to invade Germany and eventually end the war. So if you want to take some time and pause and check out this diagram, it shows some of the tactical details of D-Day. There were 5 beaches in which Allied troops invaded. The United States troops were at Omaha and Utah. Omaha was the beach that saw the largest casualties, that met the most resistance from German troops. One of the cool things about D-Day, this was in the works for almost a year before they finally carried out the invasion. D-Day also included a huge diversion campaign to trick Hitler about where the landings would actually occur and be able to make it a true surprise attack. The Germans knew that the Allies would invade across the English Channel into France, but they did not know when and they did not know where. And we, the Allies, were able to catch them off guard with our Normandy invasion. So France is liberated August 25th, 1944. We are able to bring the Normandy invasions to a conclusion with the liberation of France, and by September of 1944, most of northwestern Europe was free from the Nazis. Over in the United States, FDR won an unprecedented 4th term because the war was going well. He made the argument that he should see the country through to the end of the war. The American people agreed. Unfortunately, FDR would die a few months into his 4th term, so his choice of vice president, Harry S. Truman, became critical to the future of the war. Back in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge occurred December 1944 through January 1945. If you know about World War II, you know that we're getting close to the end of the war here. The Battle of the Bulge was fought between Germany and Allied troops. At the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were able to catch the Allies by surprise, which created a bulge in the American line, henceforth the name. They are able to capture several towns, make advances. You can see the bulge right here. But in the end, American forces, Allied forces hold. The Germans lose the Battle of the Bulge, and it is their last major attack. The Battle of the Bulge is significant for us because it was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by U.S. troops. Tens of thousands American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. So by early 1945, Germany is being closed in on the west by the Allies, and from the east by the Soviet Union. By April of 1945, U.S. and Soviet troops meet in Berlin. April 30th, Hitler took his own life in an underground bunker. Many of his other top generals, top advisors also committed suicide rather than be caught and forced to deal with the consequences of the Allies. In his final letter, Hitler blamed the loss of Germany in World War II on the Jewish people. So Germany surrenders May 7th, 1945, and May 8th, the very next day, VE Day is celebrated. VE stands for Victory in Europe. So now it's time to finish up in the Pacific theater. We'll start with the Battle of Iwo Jima. So the purpose of this battle, it was part of our island hopping strategy on the way to Japan. America does have a victory at Iwo Jima. We are able to take the island, but not without 23,000 Marine casualties. In Iwo Jima, we really begin to see the beginning of the kamikaze. These were Japanese pilots that deliberately crashed their planes full of explosives into enemy targets. As the war is going backward for the Axis powers, we begin to see much more drastic and dramatic attempts by the Japanese to win the war. It is also the Battle of Iwo Jima where we get the famous picture of the raising of the American flag by U.S. Marines. Important to our strategy in the Pacific were the Navajo code talkers. These were Navajo Native Americans who used their own Navajo language to develop a code. Because the Navajo were the only ones who spoke this language, it was basically impossible for anyone else to crack. The Japanese were never able to break any codes developed by the Navajo. So we were able to use this code to send critical messages from island to island in the Pacific. The way that we were able to get a leg up in the Pacific was being able to intercept Japanese messages, break them, and know what they were doing. They were never able to have this upper hand on us because of the work of the Navajo. Back over in Europe, I don't know why this slide is out of order. Anyways, the Yalta Conference happens in February of 1945. This is another meeting between the big three and the last meeting of these individuals of the big three. Once again, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. The purpose of the Yalta Conference was how to rebuild Europe. The decisions made at Yalta were to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation after the war. There would be a Soviet zone, a United States zone, a French zone, and a British zone of occupation. They also agreed on new borders and free elections in Eastern Europe, areas that were currently under Soviet control. And also, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan. Over in the United States, scientists and the military are working together on the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb. The heads of the project included the lead scientist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and the lead military advisor, General Leslie Groves. Upon the successful test of the atomic bomb, Oppenheimer said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Groves' reaction was a little less poetic. He said, "The war's over. One or two of those things and Japan will be finished." It did not take Harry Truman, who at this point is President of the United States, very long to decide to use this new technology against the Japanese. Even though we weren't sure exactly what the long-term effects would be, Truman decides to drop these two bombs on Japan. He was given intelligence that a mainland invasion of Japan would cost a potential 1 million American lives. So this was a decision made to quickly end the war and to save the lives of American troops. So August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The bomb was named Little Boy, carried by a plane named the Enola Gay. The bomb over Hiroshima killed 70,000 Japanese immediately, and then another 100,000 more over the next few months. After the atomic bomb was dropped, Japan refused to surrender. So on August 9th, 1945, a second bomb was dropped over Nagasaki. Another 80,000 were killed in this bomb. On August 5th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito of Japan surrenders, and VJ Day is celebrated, Victory in Japan. We're going to look at some pictures of the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's the city center of Hiroshima before and then after the bomb. You can see all of those buildings flattened. Some of the dead, some of the injured.